revenue and its sustainability long term. Then there are other things that may not have such a serious impact on immediately on revenue and business, but things that are really important to your stakeholders. Your stakeholder, who are your stakeholders? Your stakeholders is pretty much everyone. For a company, again, this, traditionally looked at shareholders, people who put in their money as the biggest stakeholder. That's no longer, they are a key stakeholder, but they are not the only stakeholder, or they are not the most important stakeholder, even as per our Companies Act, definition. So all stakeholders are sort of considered equal, and they include, of course, your investors, your employees, your suppliers, your service providers, your contractors, your vendors, your clients, local government, local communities, the environment, to the extent that even the future generations, who have a stake in, sustaining this planet. So these are all your stakeholders. Now, some of the things may be really important to them, while you as a company may not put a whole lot of significance on that particular topic, and now, because the stakeholders are equally important to you, all of them are equally important to you, you will have to look at their perspective. And therefore, your material topics, the universe, when you map it out, it will include, look at this XY plot. You are trying to, there is nothing, I have really put nothing on that map itself. Now, if you put something like climate change as a topic of importance, if you want to put that on this map, on the y-axis you have your stakeholders, how it impacts them, and on the x-axis you have the company and how it impacts. Where will you put it? If it's really important to the company, it will go to the right end along the x-axis. If it's equally important to your other stakeholders, it will move up vertically. So it will end up somewhere diagonally far out. So anything diagonally far out simply means it's really significant to both parties, and they become the core of your material topics. And that upper channel, that signifies a zone where it is important to the company and it is important to stakeholders. So as you map it, so you put water stewardship or water, or waste management. You try to plot that on this map. You will have to find a place on this map, depending on the mutual significance. And depending on where it falls, it will probably be a key action area for the company. If you find out that it's important for both parties, you need to put that in your action item. And you have an item that is actually not really important to you as a company, and neither any of your stakeholder. Obviously, it will find a place somewhere close to the intersection of x and y axis along that diagonal, somewhere very close to the corner, which means that's of low importance. And this again, with time, this assessment, if you do this, you're supposed to do this at least every year, and you will see this changing actually. So this is how you do it. When you do it, typically the material topics for most companies, of course, there is energy. Energy automatically brings climate change because there are emissions, right? So energy, emissions, climate change, they are not really, the first three are not really mutually exclusive. They are very closely intertwined. Then you have water, then you have waste, biodiversity, sometimes noise, depending on the industry. These are typically the environmental factors that companies, and some companies will go further defining this. Water is just water stewardship. You could look at rainwater harvesting. You can split it. Water efficiency, water recycling. You could look at it. So, but this is the approach. So, can we move to the next slide, please? Now we are full on to climate change. I think this is a topic that a lot of us know quite a bit, and I'm just going to cover. But in every group, whether it's a big conference, low key conference, typically the attendees are a mix of people. Some of them know a lot of things, and they have heard it over and over again, but there are people who don't really understand, where it's all coming from. So, for the speakers, it really becomes difficult to, you know, really find a place, a balance, so between these two groups. So what I have done here is, I'm going to just give fundamentals as well. What is climate change? I think some of you might know, may not know. Climate has always been changing, right? I mean, over the years, over historically, the planet has gone through continuous climate change. Climate change has always been happening. Long periods of warming and cooling and leading to multiple ice ages, all that you all must be aware of. But that is not the climate change that we are talking about. The climate change that we are talking about today is the drastic change. So that long historical pattern is almost like stationary for a generation. Between generations, that change used to be almost invisible. I mean, that was a very gradual, prolonged, natural process. Now what we are seeing is, in the last 100 years or so, since humans found out there's a huge stockpile of fossil fuels and we could use that for our um, growth agenda, things have changed. you know uh, there is a sudden and drastic change induced by our own activities, especially our own building up this stockpile of carbon in the form of fossil fuel, and releasing that into the atmosphere, and all of a sudden creating this sudden spike in the atmospheric CO2 levels, and some other greenhouse gases, leading to a very fast-paced, unnatural warming of the planet. And that's the climate change we are talking about. It's completely human-induced. And there is a natural climate change. There is a distinction as well. What is causing it? It is so. What is it? I mean, so climate change. So we get all of our energy, solar irradiation from the sun, and at that time it lands on the planet surface, and the surface warms up, water warms up. Then this is radiated back to the space. And this is where the problem is. As the greenhouse gases, so the greenhouse gas layer over the planet is a significant life giver. It is this greenhouse gas layer that keeps our planet warm and supports life. Without the greenhouse gases in the air, in the atmosphere, we couldn't live here. No life could sustain. But when that level of greenhouse gas goes too high, like today, that's when the problem is. It's a very delicate balance in the atmosphere. So now what happens is the radiation that goes back from our planet's surface, it's being stopped by this increase in levels of greenhouse gases. Basically, they are trapping this heat within the atmosphere, leading to warming. And that's what is global warming. I mean, the human induced global warming. That is even, I mean, in the normal course of time, that is global warming. if the CO2 level and the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere was normal at normal levels, I mean, 300 ppm levels as it used to be, about 100 years ago, it still does the same process. Some of the radiation that lands on the planet is radiated back, and therefore this warming and cooling, there is a balance. And the layer of greenhouse gases retain some of that heat, enough to really sustain life on the planet. And there is a lot of that heat being retained. As the greenhouse gas concentrations continue to grow or increase in the atmosphere, more and more heat will be trapped, and we are headed to a really dire situation. So what is greenhouse gas? All gases that are capable of doing this, trapping this heat. And there are several of them. CO2 is the most prevalent and common, and therefore CO2 is synonymous. It's, most of the time when we talk about CO2, we actually mean greenhouse gas. So methane is another greenhouse gas, right? N2O is another greenhouse gas. Water vapor is actually a greenhouse gas. It helps trap, radiation. And there are many other chlorofluorocarbon. SF6, for example, sulfur hexafluoride is a very powerful greenhouse gas. All these are greenhouse gases, and they all have an impact. But the fact is that the atmosphere predominantly it's CO2. Then the second in volume terms and impact terms, it's methane. Then there are a lot of other gases that are found in very small volumes. So one exercise is to look up what are the greenhouse gases, and what are their potential. How do they stack up? Actually, CO2 is the least dangerous in terms of their power to retain heat. But in terms of volume, it beats everything else. And that's how it is the most dominant greenhouse gas. For example, the second in line, methane, is 25 times more powerful. That's the term used is the global warming potential. Okay. So methane is 25 times more potent than CO2 itself. In other words, 1 ton of methane is equivalent to 25 tons of CO2. And then SF6 is almost 20,000 plus times more potent than CO2. But SF6 in the nature, you find very little of it. And that's why if you look at any data about greenhouse gas emissions, is typically represented as tons of CO2 equivalent. You will see a little e at the end of the CO2, which means it's not just CO2, it's CO2 equivalent. That equivalent means, so all the other gases, like methane and SF6, all the other gases are also included in the calculation. They use that conversion and represented in equivalent terms. So if it is 1 ton of CO2 plus 1 ton of methane, that is 1 ton plus 25 tons equivalent, that is total 26 tons CO2 equivalent. You see? Because the methane 1 ton we are converted into CO2 equivalent, and together now it is 26 tons equivalent. That's why, and that is always presented as CO2 equivalent. Now we know that we are at a very difficult situation. Global warming is accelerating. So in 2015, at the UNFCCC, we have reached a global pact called the Paris Agreement. So Paris, what is Paris Agreement? Paris Agreement is a pact to actually limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and even make efforts to keep that at 1.5 degrees. And I think you need to really look up what it means. when you say well below 2 degrees, what is that 2 degrees? 2 degrees is the warming, you know, like how, from what? I am in Mumbai, it's usually, around 30 degrees. Are we looking at 32 degrees? No, that's not the concept. It's not wherever you are 2 degrees. That is not the concept. The planet, there is an average historical temperature established uh, pre-industrial. Pre-industrial is before we started digging up all this fossil fuel and really started causing this damage. From 1850s, we have been keeping temperature records. So the average planet temperature established before the industrial age, the pre-industrial average, I think that's around 17, 18 degrees. So we are looking at a global average temperature moving above that baseline. So 2 degrees, while it sounds like a really small number, it's a massive uh, um, differentiator in terms of planets capacity to cope with warming. Um, that 2 degrees, if you look at the planet, the amount of water and land it has amounts to humongous amount of heat, additional heat. And that's why it is such a small number, but it represents such a huge danger. And that is what Paris Agreement is trying to do. And so we are now, that we are trying to keep that warming at 1.5 degrees, which everybody thinks is going to be very difficult. We can talk a little bit about that later if we have time. Um, why the 2 degrees? I mean, so 1 degree, we already crossed 1 degree. I think we should all know that. We have already passed the 1 degree mark. We are, I think last year, we are at 1.13 degrees. And you read newspaper, watch news. We are already seeing so much of havoc being caused across the world. Historical floods to historical droughts to wildfires everywhere. No snow in peak snow season and snowing in unseasonal times. All kinds of unforeseen weather we are seeing. And we are going to see more of it in the coming years. So 2 degrees is really, I mean, 1.13 is what's causing it, right? Now we are moving towards 1.5, and scientists are saying that in the next 5 years, there's a very high chance that at least once we will reach the 1.5 degree mark. That means we are going to really get into a zone of, heightened, um, um, drastic, intense, and devastating weather pattern. And that's why 2 degrees is a tipping point. If we hit 2 degrees, we are going to constantly go down a path where things will never be the same. We will not have a chance to recover and come back ever. And that's why, so Paris Agreement is to limit it not at 2. It says well below 2. Okay, I think that's another distinction we need to give. Paris is not limiting it at 2. 2 is actually too high, well below 2. Um, so, um, so all parties, India is a party to the UNFCCC, and we have ratified the Paris Agreement. So have 196 countries in the world, right? And then the next slide, we have what we have committed to. So under the Paris Agreement, all countries are going to do what best they can in a process called nationally determined contributions towards Paris Agreement, right? NDCs, you would all heard that. We'll see what we have. So that is the national commitment. Now the world is committed through Paris Agreement. The country is committed. As corporates, I think we have a responsibility now to act and align our activities to the Paris Agreement. Can we move to the next slide, please? Shivangi, can we just recalibrate the time, assuming that, knowing that we started late, what would be the stopping time?
I think it will be 1.
Okay. Thank you. So, what has India committed under the Paris Agreement? Nationally determined contributions or NDCs, right? Um, all countries have. If you look at UN, this is another thing I think you should look at. I have listed India's commitments. In 2015 itself, um, most countries have submitted their first NDCs, first set of NDCs. Of course, the NDCs were supposed to be ambitious in line with the Paris Agreement commitment or goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees, right? And then every 5 years, countries were supposed to revamp that, enhance the commitment. And we also have done that. And so these are our revamped commitments. The first commitment was actually 30 to 33% emission reduction, intensity reduction. Now it's 45%. What it says, our GDP, intensity of our GDP. That means, our per rupee, you can say per thousand rupee, per million rupees, whatever, that emission intensity, CO2 per, say, let's put 1,000 rupees or 1,000,000 rupees, that will be reduced by 45% compared to 2005 levels by 2030. So that's how to read it, right? These commitments, typically you need a starting block, which is a baseline over which you count your commitment. Then you have a finishing time. So you're saying compared to 2005, by 2030, we will reduce our emission intensity. 50% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel. Basically, these are very tricky terms. Non-fossil fuel based energy. See, non-fossil fuel based energy, is it really same as renewable energy? It could be argued that it is. It could be argued that it's not. Non-fossil fuel based does include nuclear, does include large hydro. In the traditional definition of renewable power, some of this may not find a place. So that's the difference. But anyway, this is how it is defined. Creation of carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 gigatons to forest. Forest absorb and sequester or lock in carbon. And when you say forest, what do you think? I mean, living forever, right? That's the idea of a forest. Forests don't come and go. Forests stay. Therefore, whatever carbon they lock in, they stay in place forever. They stay, grounded. They don't come into the atmosphere, and that's the beauty of. Therefore, forests are a great carbon sink. We are committed to create additional carbon sink through forestation, but we haven't done a whole lot there. Then, at the Glasgow COP, or Conference of Parties, the UN Climate Conference every year, we have announced that we will be carbon neutral or net zero by 2070. So, so these are our net zero is not really counted as an NDC. It is a standalone commitment. The other three are our NDCs. Okay, but I think you should look up. You can look at what China, as the largest emitter, China has committed to. You can look up what the US has committed to. It's interesting to know. You can also find out that all these NDCs put together are nowhere close to emission reduction required to keep the global warming well below 2 degrees. So we are all undercommitted. I mean, the whole world. Can we move to the next slide, please? We talked about global warming issue, Paris Agreement. I'm just not going to be looking at questions now because I'm going to get distracted. I think we will, we lost time. I need to let's go through this, and we can take up questions later. Okay? Because I saw some things popping up. Um, Mitigation versus adaptation. Now, climate change is a reality. It is happening. Huge quantities of emissions are still happening. We still haven't really come off fossil fuel. Fossil fuel is still being, extracted, consumed. A lot of investments going there. So um, we haven't really. What is mitigation adaptation? When climate scientists found out that this is really hitting the roof. This is a real threat challenge. They identified two issues. One, of course, we need to um, curtail this problem, right? I mean, it's almost like global warming. If you look at it, it's almost like a weight gain issue. If at a very personal level, it's on the way to look at it like a weight gain. And if you are looking and if you are facing that challenge, what are the actions that you will take? The mitigative action is, probably there is an issue with food intake, right? As long as you are consuming more calories than you need, that situation not going to change. So for climate change, I think you have a similar situation. The situation is caused by CO2 levels or greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere, and as long as you put more CO2 into the atmosphere, um, you know, you know, that situation is going to just get worse. So the mitigation measure is, how can I actually control the CO2 levels in the atmosphere, greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere? So I need to cut down the emissions, keep reducing it. So maybe I will, stabilize the CO2 levels at some level, at a very high level, and then slowly bring it down. So that is mitigation, really controlling the emissions and thereby controlling the greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere, which is the root cause. The other part is, dealing with the impact that is already there and which is already going to happen for a while. Even while we are taking mitigative action, imagine in the atmosphere there is still a huge accumulation. We are still pumping in. Any mitigative action is only marginal at this point. It's not closing the tap right away. So it will continue to go. So the CO2 levels will continue to climb. So that means we will continue to face global warming and all the impacts. So how do you deal with that? Like we remember the big floods in Pakistan last year. We also have had, not so big, but events. Um, I think the world is getting into a really tricky scenario. Um, there is a reason why the world thinks that countries like India is actually the most vulnerable because the huge population and the over reliance on farming, and so in a similar scenario it will take only just imagine one harvest season. We India having a huge impact on farming, one harvest season, and dents our grain output by, say, even 5%, or 5 to 10%, we will have a mammoth problem. Not only us, the whole world. Immediately, I think the whole world will change because our grain requirements, food requirements, are so massive. We produce about 100 million tons of wheat, 100 more than that of rice, and about 100 million wheat, and we consume most of it because the population needs it. If we are short of 10 million or 20 million, who's going to, we may not have anyone to, to step up and supply that because there's simply no supply. So that's why we are so vulnerable. And then what do we do? I mean, where do we go? It's not like if there is more money and we can get it from somewhere else, or there will be some charity, we will, countries will step in and supply. The whole world will suffer because there will be a real shortage across the world. So, that's why, I mean, we will continue to be the most vulnerable now, for many reasons, because geographically, population-wise, all that. So how do we adapt, and how do we minimize these impacts? Long droughts and shortage of drinking water, um, you know, food shortages, water shortages, spread of diseases. We have seen COVID. COVID may not be the only thing. I can tell you just yesterday. I mean, somebody just was sent a video clip at some village in Tamil Nadu, where population of ants, red ants. These are ants that they don't even bite. A whole village had abandoned their village and taken their possession and moved out because these red ants have, taken over the land. You cannot walk there. You cannot stand there. They're all over you. They don't bite you, but apparently they have some kind of acid, and there's nothing you can do. I mean, this is all driven by this favorable, and they like this warm, conditions. You can't really, we can imagine, the kind of things that will happen because of climate change. So adaptation means that, to the extent we can, preparing for it, planning for it, minimizing the impact. Farmers are trying to get into more drought resistant species, all that, right? And things that require less water, all that. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, so we talked about mitigation, adaptation, and so mitigation is a big part of adaptation. Adaptation happens at a very community level, government level, because it needs system-wide, community-wide, processes and programs. While mitigation is a little more easier to identify with, I can do it. You can do it at a very personal level. You can do it in your house. It's just doing things where you can see, by doing this, I can avoid some emissions, consuming less power, traveling less. Maybe instead of using my motorbike to go everywhere, I will use a cycle to for local whatever, when I go to pick up some vegetables. I mean, I'm just saying small things. So when it comes to mitigation, there are things that everyone can do. Of course, corporates have a big role to play because uh, business activities constantly involve use of fuel, mobility, combustion, use of steam, fuel, power, all that, electricity. Uh, you know, but how do you look at emissions? How do you quantify emissions? The quantification of emissions in a systematic way within certain boundary, which we call greenhouse gas accounting. How do you do it? So when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, I think we all know that there are three types of three categories of emissions: scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 emission, how do you define it? Scope 1 is called a direct emission, and it's direct because scope 1 emission happens wherever the source is within the boundary that we are considering. For example, within a house or within an office, within a company. A company's boundary, you should see that it's a little fluid. A company's boundary is not necessarily within its walls. It extends to its supply chain and transportation. It's a sales network, many things. So within the boundary, it happens. For example, in the house, if you have a um, fuel using device, a lamp that uses fuel, even coconut oil lamp, it's burning a fuel. There is CO2. While that CO2 may be considered renewable, but I'm just saying. So if you have diesel run pump in your land, right, in your house, you're using in the well or whatever for farming and irrigation, there you use diesel. I mean, that is scope one. Same thing for companies. If you have a DG set running on diesel, that is scope one. All vehicles running, the company owned vehicles, diesel, petrol, all that will count towards scope one. If you are a heavy industry where you have a boiler, you're using coal or diesel or some gas, that is scope one. Scope two is an indirect emission, and it specifically considers emissions from the use of electricity, purchased electricity actually. It is indirect. I said scope one is direct because that emission is happening right there within the boundary. Scope 2, coming from linked to electricity, the emission is indirect. Why? I am sitting in this office, there is lighting, there is air conditioning, and this is the boundary, my office building, but there's no emission happening here. The emission is happening in some power plant where this power is produced, right? So it's away, one step away from me, one or two steps away from me. But I know, it's just happening in a power plant where maybe coal is being burnt to give me this power, and I can relate one unit I'm consuming to certain quantity of coal being burned in the power plant, and therefore CO2, right? So that's how scope 2 is connected. Scope 1 is direct connect. I'm using some diesel here. I mean, I'm using 2 liters, then there is that connect. Now, scope 3, everything else, any other emissions that you can think of is scope 3. Scope 3 is also indirect. So scope 1 is direct, 2 and 3 are indirect. So scope 3 includes, several categories. For a business, employees commuting to work, that is scope 3. So they may be taking a bus, they may be taking a cab, they could be sharing a cab, they could be taking their own two-wheeler, four-wheeler, many ways. That's all of that, that is scope 3. Business travel, your bosses may be flying, that's business travel. They could be staying in a hotel for business purpose, that's also scope 3. There are many other forms of scope 3 emissions. I will talk about accounting guidelines. You should look at that and find out what are the other scope 3 items. There are 15 defined scope 3 items. So this quantification of scope 1, 2, and 3 within a boundary, and putting out that number as your carbon footprint is the greenhouse gas accounting process. Source wise, you account and then add them up. So this is like a financial accounting, right? Finally, you figure out what is your total tonnage. X tons of CO2 equivalent is your carbon footprint. It could be in an office. It could be your personal carbon footprint. It could be for a company, which includes its offices, its factories, its transportation network, all of that. And what should be included, what should not be included, how that should be calculated. There are standards available. What are those standards? There is a general standard It's called ESG protocol, corporate accounting and reporting standard. And then there's a scope 3 specific standard, because scope 3 is very complex. There are multiple items. And typically the important thing about scope 3 is that you usually don't have any direct data for scope 3. For example, your employees are taking public transport. You know that, and you have 100 employees, you know that there is some emission attributable to that, but you have no idea. You have no direct data. So you'll have to deploy some indirect process to estimate that emission. So scope 3, because it uses such indirect approaches, there is a detailed guideline. So this is another exercise I would request you to undertake. Go through these standards and see how they are. Look at the scope 3 different categories. See if you can do it for yourself or your company. Take it as an exercise, right? What are the types of ESG emissions? Scope 1, 2, and 3. How do you report it? So finally, you add all of your scope 1, 2, and 3, you will get a total tonnage. So you will report it as X tons CO2 equivalent is my total CO2 emissions or my carbon footprint for the year so and so. So that's typically, you can look at any sustainability report, you will see that number. Sometimes companies will report scope 1, 2, and 3 separately and then add them up. Now, so these are absolute emission numbers, right? CO2 in tonnage. But typically, companies also like to report them as an intensity. Remember, we talked about India's nationally determined contributions, and our first commitment is to reduce GDP intensity by 45%. There are no emission numbers mentioned there, right? There are not CO2 figure mentioned there. I mean, do you know what our total emission is? India's total CO2 emissions. That's another number you may want to look up. And do you even know? So, what is our GDP? Our emissions keep growing, our GDP keeps growing. So, that's the trick. So, a lot of corporates and companies, they use an intensity instead of absolute emissions in terms of X tons. So X tons will be there, and typically what happens, X tons, for a growing company, that will continue to grow, because if I am, adding new production capacity, I am adding a new factory, I am enhancing capacity, I have new offices, I have more employees, more revenue. No matter what actions I take, I'm going to see some growth in my CO2, right, emissions. But does that mean that I am irresponsible? I am not taking any actions. In fact, while I am doing this, I reduced my emissions, quite a bit, because right now, from no renewable energy 5 years ago, now I am using 50% renewable energy. So both of these are happening parallelly. How do you actually then bring the great action that you're taking into the picture? That's when the intensity comes. So intensity is a ratio, right? That's the beauty of the ratio. So for example, your tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced, that's an intensity, and that's a very important intensity ratio. Or ton of cement produced. Now, what do you do for services? For services, for IT services company, they sell services. Their product is service. You cannot say my CO2 per service. So typically that will be put under as per revenue, per $1,000 or per million rupees, whatever. So intensities are great way to look at your emission trajectory, capturing your activities as well as your growth. So if you are actually taking, so as a ratio, if I am a steel manufacturer, I have a ratio of 10. Now going forward, that ratio should be always coming down if I'm taking any action. My new plants, new capacity should be more efficient, better, and my existing ones, I should be constantly trying to reduce my CO2. So I should be really nibbling at this 10. 10 should be coming down. If I go for a completely new technology, it should even drop drastically. So therefore, intensity is a great figure to go look at. Most companies would be looking at intensity than absolute emissions. Um, so we have covered everything on this. So the accounting standard, the greenhouse gas protocol, these protocols have been developed jointly by two well-known entities: WBCSD, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and WRI, World Resources Institute. If you look up this guidance, you will see information on both of them. Okay. Can we move to the next slide, please? So now in the previous slide, you saw how you report your carbon footprint, total emissions. It could be intensity, it could be absolute. In fact, at your level, you will have all this data. You will have the absolute numbers, you will have intensity numbers, you will have scope 1, 2, 3 split, all that you will have, right? Now, you also now know, because you have captured the data and you know what is contributing what, which is the big ticket items, which is a small ticket item, where you should act, you should target. I think you have a very good idea now. I mean, if you've done that, now how do you target? How do you look at reducing emissions, right? You know, you will look at your scope 1, 2, and 3, and it's if you have done the numbers right yourself, you know intuitively where the opportunities are. You know. Today, I think a lot of opportunities have opened up, you know, including if you have your own vehicle fleet, you know, today you could look at switching to EVs. And there is an important another thing to consider there. I will talk about that later. DG said you're consuming a lot of fuel. What can you do? Can you look at reducing the footprint from that? Maybe. Can you look at improving efficiency? Can you consume less diesel to generate same amount of power or more power? And the ratio, you know, units per, you know, can you improve that ratio? Can you even replace your old DG set, for, you know, with a new high efficient one? Some investment involved. Can you look at the payback period? Can you switch to some other fuel? You know, maybe biodiesel. So this is the way you look at, you know, source-wise, you know, what you can do. What is easy? Is it easy to do? How much money I have to spend? What is the time frame I'm looking at? Who are the suppliers? Who is service provider? Is it feasible? Who else is doing something like that? You know, what other companies? This is how you look at, you know, this is exactly from a corporate point of view, how you approach this. Scope 2 is a great, a big action area for a lot of companies because you have direct control over it and a lot of things you can do. Electricity consumption, right, in your offices. You are in charge. You are the consumer, so you can do things. You know, even just behavioral changes. You know, switching off things when you are not, needing it, or even putting sensors. You know, replacing inefficient, things with more efficient fixtures. There are so many things you can do. So that is the efficiency part, right? Then you can switch to renewable energy, right? You could have rooftop solar, you could buy renewable power. So renewable power has no emissions. So that's how you look at your scope 2. Now, scope 3, while you have very little control, there are still things you can do. I mean, employee commute. I mean, can you promote EVs? Can you promote those who are driving on vehicle alone, one four-wheeler, one person, in and out? They can they look at carpooling? Can they look at um, public transport, for example? People who are not far from office, can they ride a bike? I mean, can the company promote some of these activities? Things like that. I mean, there is a solution here in every aspect, and you can explore that. Business travel. Business travel, over the years, a lot of companies have focused on video conferencing facilities. So they can avoid big teams, groups traveling across the world. At the IT company. Today, everybody thrives on it. I mean, the whole 2020 and 2021, the entire world operated with that. So it is doable, but by nature, we like to interact with people and like to travel. And maybe there is a balance that can be drawn. And this is how you look at emission reduction. What are the levers? So renewable energy efficiency, is a big lever available for emission reduction. It can be any resource. Even imagine if you are a production facility, manufacturing facility, even the use of the material usage efficiency will have ultimately an impact on your energy use and therefore carbon. Because everything takes, if you used a ton less material, for example, you're a cement plant, if you're using 100 tons less material over a year, that's 100 tons less extracted and hauled into your plant and all that. There is a huge emission saving. So electricity saving for sure. So efficiency, renewable energy, right? And electric mobility. So renewable energy is, if you look at the larger picture, a lot of the fossil fuel use and emissions are coming from one electricity sector. Power sector consumes a lot of fossil fuel. So transitioning that, even at a corporate level, that's the way it is. Switching to renewable power. That's one main lever in emission reduction across the world. The next is where do you use a lot of fuel? Mobility. Now you can replace fossil fuel mobility with electric mobility. But remember, so you are not going to the gas station or petrol pump to put diesel or petrol. Instead, you're plugging it in. Right now, you are an EV, you're plugging it in. But as long as this power is coming from a coal-fired power plant, you still haven't made the complete switch. So that first lever, the energy transition, when that is complete, only then this will be complete. And I know there is no, which should happen first, and this will happen simultaneously. So, these two together will take care of a big chunk of global fossil fuel usage. So these two are the biggest levers: renewable energy, electric mobility. Now we hear a lot about green hydrogen. Why? Because even with these two, a lot of engineering, manufacturing, steel, cement, aluminum, critical industries in the economy, they use a lot of fossil fuel directly. So there, hydrogen as a fuel is expected to replace the fuel usage. So that, to me, that becomes another important lever. So with these two, three, of course, in order for these to really succeed, you need a lot of grid infrastructure, you need a lot of storage energy. Renewable energy is not a firm power. It needs to be stored and then supplied so that output is stable, throughout the day, 24/7. So emission reduction levers, as I said, efficiency, renewable power, electric mobility, green hydrogen, energy storage, all that will help. Next slide, please. Okay, now on to some global concepts. I think you all have heard of this concept, net zero. You also heard of science-based targets. and carbon neutral has been there for a long time. So let's, where are all these coming from? These are all sort of carbon neutral concept was there for a long time, right? Basically, we looked at how we would estimate the carbon footprint of a company. I mean, that can be, you can do that for an event, for a person, for a family, I mean, any entity within certain time and boundary. So, carbon neutral and net zero, um, there is a slight difference, and I'll tell you what that is. Essentially means that your net for a year, for a period of time, is zero. Basically, you're trying to say that your net contribution, net CO2 contribution, net GHG contribution to the atmosphere for that year, for that period, is zero. That is the idea you're trying to convey by saying net zero and carbon neutral. Now, the difference is carbon neutral, um, you know, both carbon neutral and net zero assumes that you will do whatever you can to reduce and avoid emissions. For example, office, lighting you need, air conditioning you need, you have printers, copiers, you have laptops, a lot of plugged-in devices, UPS, blah, blah, blah. They all consume power. Now you can install the most efficient in the most optimal way and operate them sensor based, all that. So you do your best, and you saved 30-40%, right? Like a platinum certified building, you avoided by design and putting the best in place. You almost took out 50%. Then you have a solar rooftop, and then a lot of power is coming from that. And ultimately, at the end of the year, you calculate your carbon footprint. It's what used to be 100 tons is now only 12 tons. But you still have 12 tons. You're still not zero. So that what the leftover quantum of emissions, you need to make that zero to claim carbon neutral or net zero. For carbon neutral, you can actually, what the process you used is offsetting. Offsetting is for the 12 tons, you have net emissions now. You go somewhere and find an activity which results in CO2 emissions, but you undertake an activity uh, or intervention through which you avoid emissions that would have happened. So you when you took up an activity, somebody was using diesel for a particular activity. You stepped in and said, okay, I'm going to give you this new technology, I'm going to pay for it, whatever the process you decide, um, um, which results in 12 tons of CO2 emission avoidance at your end. But I'm going to pay for it, but I'm going to take credit for that 12 tons because I'm going to use that avoided emission credit and offset my 12 tons, and therefore my company can claim that it is carbon neutral. That's how, of course, what you do, that intervention I talked about, there is protocol around it. It's not just, plug and play. There are global processes around it, and you have to follow that. So offsets and the process you can look at, that's another thing you could look at. What is carbon offset? I have some note here. I think we will spend a little more time. So that is carbon neutrality. So to deal with your last remaining tonnage of emissions, you try to offset by avoiding equal emissions somewhere else. Now, net zero has a slightly different, concept. Net zero says that's not going to cut it. You doing something somewhere else and taking credit here and offsetting, that is not going to be enough. In fact, for the 12 tons left over, in order to be net zero, you need to somehow remove 12 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, one way or the other. So, it's not your same CO2 molecules that you released, but some CO2 molecules you remove 12 tons. So two popular ways of removing that is one through technology. You all may have heard of carbon removal, carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and usage, all that. So CO2 can be captured back from the atmosphere using technology. And if you can remove 12 tons, then you can use that to counter your 12 tons and say, I am net zero. The other way is something called nature based. Remember, under India's NDCs, we have a forest cover creation and sequestering carbon. That's another way. So that is also removing carbon from. So today, if there is a 100 hectare parcel of land, barren land, and 10 years from now, you create a thriving forest there. You can, 100 hectares, you cannot call it a forest, but green cover there, and you promise to protect that forever. Keep that forever. Then you have sequestered. You have taken a lot of carbon from the atmosphere and locked it in there, and it's going to stay there. So that is the other way. That is carbon removal from the atmosphere. It's a slow process. That is a nature-based process. Both are valid. And then, so removal. If you can remove the last remaining equivalent quantum of emissions, then you can claim net zero. That's why not many companies are claiming net zero now. They're all saying we'll be net zero 2035, 40, 50, including countries. And so because the removal part is not yet really cracked, we don't have the technologies of scale. Even the nature-based process is pretty complex, okay? Now SBT, again, SBT was born along with the Paris Agreement, science-based targets. The entire Paris Agreement was built along science. Science said, we need to keep it global warming well below 2 degrees. And, Paris Agreement also said, um, uh, the planet, we have certain fossil fuel budget or CO2 emission budget, for that. So if we set 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees as the target line, that means we can emit only so much CO2 into the atmosphere. So we have fixed our budget, the entire population, the planet. If we are looking at well below 2 degree as a screen sitting there, a wall sitting there, then we are allowed to, and if the serious target, then we are allowed to only emit so much. That means we will have to cut it off at some point, right? And so that is the carbon budget they have come up with. And that leaves us only very little at today's emission levels. If we don't do any action by like 2030, 35, we will reach that, and we will cross that target that we have set. That's why there is this whole struggle to cut emissions really fast. And science-based target is actually built back on this concept of our carbon budget. That's why it's science-based. If everybody takes up science-based targets, then everybody becomes aligned to the Paris Agreement, which becomes a unified goal for the whole planet. And therefore, we are all driving towards the same goal. And that was the whole idea. And how it does is through simulations. If you as a company want to reduce such SBT, science-based targets, then what they will do is look at your current emissions, look at your projections of growth and everything, and they will come up with, for this well below 2 degree pathway, what should be your year-on-year emissions, and based on that, what would be your near term, mid-term, long-term targets? They will give you two time zone targets. Of course, they that means there is also an yearly target which you need to really keep track of if you want to achieve these two milestones. And in fact, science-based targets will give you two pathways. One is well below 2 degrees, one is 1.5 degrees. Obviously, if you're targeting 1.5 degrees, your targets are going to be stiffer, right? Because you have to cut your emissions faster at a faster pace. So that is SBT. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands, actually thousands of companies have set SBT. In fact, SBT is concrete action. SBT does not. So when SBT gives you a target, say midterm 5-year and 15-year term target or 10-year target, these targets are actual reduction targets. You cannot use any offsets. You cannot use any of that. Through actual action, you have to reduce these emissions. And therefore, it reflects really concrete commitment, concrete action. Unlike net zero, most of the net zero commitments are just commitments by word. It's a target sitting way down in the future timeline somewhere. Many people are not even interested in, taking immediate action. So can we move to the next one, please? Next slide, please.
We have some questions. Do you want to take them at the end, or should we pause?
Yeah. And I think because otherwise, so I won't be able to manage the time. I mean, if the time is not open-ended, right? So
yes, sir. So should we continue, right?
Continue, yes.
Yeah.
And I know there'll be a lot of questions. Good to have questions. Some of them you will have to look up by yourself, but we will take some of them for sure. Carbon price, you would have heard of carbon price, internal carbon price. Carbon price generically means any kind of price you put on carbon, or basically greenhouse gas emissions. It could be in the form of a tax, it could be in the form of a cap and trade, it could become a cess, some kind of levy, all that, It could be through a carbon market. It could be just simply a tax the government puts on it. It could be a levy, fuel levy, appropriately tagged. So all this, any kind of price put on the underlying carbon is considered a carbon price, and there are many forms of it. And why it is in, and I think world has proven, for many years now, everyone has been saying, like people have been saying for water, water is a neglected commodity in India because we have failed to put a fair price on water. I think this is something that you will hear very often. The cost of water is so low here; it's so low price. You go to a place like Spain, and you go sit for a meal. Then, if they are serving water, you're going to cough up easily 2-3 euros for water. So we haven't come to that. We haven't priced water. We are not paying a price for water, and therefore nobody cares. We don't really care for it. So they said, the best way to tackle emissions is to put a price on carbon. That was the concept, and and how do you put a price on carbon? I mean, what is the price? That price has, I think, two levels. One, you can look at in terms of there are actually two ways to look at. One, look at my office here. I know I have certain emissions, right? Because I am consuming electricity from the grid. I have lighting. I have air conditioning 24/7. I have a lot of equipment running here. So therefore, I know I have certain carbon footprint here, right? Now, what is the price of the carbon? One way to look at it, if I want to get rid of it, I want to become zero carbon, right? I want to avoid all that. So I could be buying renewable energy. I could be buying and putting the best possible technology everywhere, and then remaining I buy renewable energy, and so many options. I do a mix of these. So I spend a little extra money, and I actually become avoid take out the entire CO2 from this building. So there is a cost involved. I mean that I could consider that as my price of carbon per ton, right? And of course, every year I'm going to pay for that, because that's so that could be my price of carbon. But then carbon price is another element. It is because of this CO2 that is going out, a lot of other people are paying a price. The people who are not responsible for the CO2, they are paying a price. And it's happening, and it's a very difficult process. Everybody is putting the CO2 into the same atmosphere, one planet, one atmosphere. It's a global phenomenon. So, what the people in Pakistan went through when the major flood happened, what people in Maui going through, in Canada going through major wildfires, it's all, happening through the same phenomenon. And it's a cumulative effect of all the CO2 that is piled up there. So if you kind of price in all these impacts and the sufferings and the losses, what would be the price of carbon? And that is the real price of carbon. And that concept has come into mainstream a long time ago. Some World Bank and some organization already consider an individual carbon price in project assessment and things like that. And many countries have carbon tax. For example, Sweden has a carbon tax that is 125 euros, close to that. Europe, the EU has a carbon market. The EU ETS, emission trading scheme. EU ETS is a what we call a compliance carbon market. What they created a carbon market with several high emission industry sectors such as fertilizer, cement, steel, glass, all that. And they said, you all will have to, we are going to give you, or we are going to cap your emissions, limit your emissions. And if you emit more, then you will have to pay money and buy certificates, carbon certificates. And if you do better, then you'll have to sell. It's the same market mechanism, buy and sell. Those who do better than the emission benchmark set, they can sell their credits. Those who are not doing so well, they will have to buy and match. So that market mechanism, that's a market price discovery for carbon. The EU ETS carbon price is now about 90 euros. It had touched about 100 euros in 2021, 22, 21, I think. So that is also a carbon price. So all these industries are, if they are not meeting their uh, allowed benchmark emission, then they are buying this at this price. Many countries have national carbon markets. China has a carbon market. There, the price is pretty low. They're only $8. So these are all carbon markets and carbon prices. These are so obviously the Chinese carbon market at 8 euros, it is some sort of an offset price. It doesn't take into consideration the real community cost of carbon. So this is another thing that I wanted to just maybe even write a blog, an article. Look at the whole idea of carbon price. And do we have a carbon price in India? We don't. But if you remember, there was something that was considered a carbon price. We used to have a renewable energy cess on coal before GST. There was a 400 rupees per ton cess on coal. It was tagged renewable energy cess, and it was a carbon tax, right? And the money was supposed to be collected and utilized for national emission reduction programs. Some of it was used, some of it wasn't. But when the GST came, I think government has rolled it over into like a compensation, state compensation session. They changed the name itself. Therefore, it is not considered a carbon tax now. We don't have a carbon market also. We are part of a global voluntary carbon market in the sense that in India, we do generate some carbon credits. Um, other other mostly corporates from other countries, they are free to come and buy that because there are no restrictions as of yet. And it's part of, and at what price and from where, who, all that is uncontrolled. It's completely voluntary. Other than that, we don't have a what we call compliance regulated carbon market like the EU ETS or the one in China. But we are looking at something like that happening though. So we may have a carbon price model coming in so I think so now in relation, I want to also the carbon price. So for the first time, we are also going to see an international carbon price in terms of international carbon tax. So the EU has launched a program called Border Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. It is a carbon tax that's going to be imposed on goods imported into the EU zone, and they have specified certain sectors: cement, steel, fertilizer, power, and things like that. Six sectors. And some of these goods India is exporting to the EU, therefore India will be impacted. So that carbon tax, this CBAM carbon tax, is going to be based on the delta between the emission difference between the Indian goods and the EU goods. The EU goods are supposed to have very low emissions. India has high emissions. So the difference will be taxed. And again, you can look at that in detail, right? So carbon tax is becoming international. It's going to impact international trade as well. Next slide, please. Carbon mark offsets versus removals. I already covered. I mean, offsets are when you step outside your operational boundary and look at an intervention, and where you have an opportunity to, where today the baseline scenario is where there's a lot of CO2 emission happening. You find a way with the new technology or a new way of doing. You take have an intervention where you reduce all of that emission or some of it emission, which can be quantified, verified, and that can be used as an offset. Offsets are also reported in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent. Okay. And so are removals. All these are reported in tons of CO2 equivalent. They are equivalent. Therefore, when you try to offset with your corporate emissions, they are in equivalent terms already. You can, so 1 ton here is equivalent to 1 ton. So you use 1 ton from the other side, you can remove 1 ton from here, and that's how the counterbalancing is done. So these offsets and removals can be actually traded in a carbon market, and it's globally it is happening now. A lot of it is happening in the voluntary market. Voluntary market in the sense, I can give you for example, an Indian company X, I'm going to name it. They have taken a commitment saying that they will be carbon neutral, or they will be net zero, right, by 2030. Now they have a lot of emission. They are taking a lot of internal actions. they are reducing their emissions, they are using more and more renewable energy, they are actually using 80% renewable energy. Still, there's still a significant ton of CO2 left at the end of the year. So now they also have a plan. By 2030, that's the deadline. They continue to grow. They're taking action, but they have a projection. By 2030, they still need about 100,000 tons of. They will still have about 100,000 tons of emissions to deal with, right? So now they will try to um, procure offsets or removals from the market, in the voluntary market, because this commitment is a voluntary commitment. It is nothing to do with regulation. Nobody has enforced it on them. It's a corporate voluntary commitment. Therefore, they will go voluntarily to buy this. They will buy. They will look for it in India. They could go to Nepal. They could do some intervention their own. They could go to, Africa. Same thing. A company sitting in the USA, Microsoft or X or Facebook, they could take a similar commitment and they could be projecting that, okay, 2030, I need actually 2 million tons equivalent of offset or removals. So I need to start looking. So I will go anywhere I can get, I will go buy. That's how the voluntary market works, right? Compliance market, as I said, it would be a locked-in system for a selected sectors. So the supply and demand both are created within that group. So it is an enclosed market. Outsider has no role to play. It is a tool to, so I told you about the EU ETS, EU emission trading scheme, the EU's compliance carbon market. There, so every year the government is going to say, okay, this year your benchmark is this. Next year it would be several percentage less than this year's. So they are going to gradually reduce that allocation or cap, forcing them to continually reduce their emissions. So that is the ultimate goal. So, some companies will take a long-term view. They will invest in new technologies and they will they will reduce faster than what the government or the regulation requires. Therefore, they will create surplus emission, which will be sold as credits, and somebody will buy it and they get paid for it. So it's a fair deal. And that is because it's a market mechanism. There is a fair price. So at 90 euros or 100 euros a ton, it's a fair price. I mean, to me, it could and it is expected to go further up. Who decides the price? So if it's a pure carbon tax, like I said, so it's many Nordic countries have, many European countries have actually tax regimes. It's a government set target. Like for example, Sweden, um, you know, and it's a set value, and they just tax you at that rate, right? Or it could be a market discovery price, like the EU ETS. Um, so carbon price could be, and or it could be like a levy, like the government of India had on coal under the renewable green energy cess. That's a fixed price. Where it came from, government decided this is how much we're going to charge because they thought it's reasonable. It would raise a significant amount of money for further emission reduction actions. So that's how the prices are decided different ways. Who manages the market? The global voluntary market, nobody is managing, right? So there is, as the demand, when companies start scouting for credits, there are certain intermediaries in the marketplace, agents or sellers. They will start scouting. So eventually, the idea or the news spread that there is growing demand. So the project developers who will actually generate this credit, they will get into action. It's like any other demand supply. When people see demand for certain product or service growing, they start investing, right? It's the same process. So that's how the market is managed. For a compliance market, it's a very strictly monitored and controlled, navigated marketplace. And if you look at the EU ETS market, it is really critical that that benchmark setting is so important. If they go too far or too low, then they will kill the program. It will be impossible for keeping that balance. The idea is to keep the balance. There is some companies are able to do better and create surplus, and some companies will fail because it's not easy to do so. So there is always that balance. So the market who manage the market, in the compliance market, the government will manage the market. Open market, nobody does. It's just supply demand. Does it really help? Yeah, I mean, so the compliance market, the voluntary market is always a question because it's not tracked and monitored. It's always questioned whether are they making genuine impact or not. Compliance market, EU ETS claims that they have reduced emissions by 43% so far. But the EU ETS started in 2005. It's almost 18, 19 years. So, but they have made significant progress. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Risk and opportunity. I think this is the last session. I think I have one more slide. Climate, as I said, brings a lot of risk, physical risk. All this, unpredictable weather brings a lot of physical risk. Your standing crop could be damaged. Your standing assets, properties, house, offices, infrastructure, all that could be damaged, right? Transition risk. What is the transition risk? The whole world is transitioning. If you are a coal power producer and if you have a lot of investment in that, and you will be very worried because the more currently the investment is going into renewable. At some point, will it happen so that nobody would want my power? I would be left with no takers for my power. So that kind of transition, how fast the transition. For example, the EV transition. I mean, there is no predicting, when the whole game will gravitate towards EVs and people wouldn't want any IC engines anymore. And there are still very young, factory investments, stranded, and they are not able to make automobiles and sell and make money. So transition is a big risk. All this brings a lot of legal regulatory risk. People doing the wrong things, not doing the right things, not doing enough. All that. There could be litigations, not following regulations, or that could be risks, right? Reputation. We know that. Not just climate, the whole environment, the social, reputational risk, reputation and brand. Companies want to be looked upon as good corporate citizen, taking the right action. Market risk. Product. If you have products and services, if you don't move with the times, I mean the automobiles is a perfect example. If you are an automobile OEM and you still have no EV plans, you are guaranteed to go bust, right? You know that it's very simple. So the market brings a lot of, you need to move with the market. At the same time, if you are able to make the right move at the right time, it will reward you. The markets will reward you. I'm sorry. Tesla became such a superstar because they got into this whole transitional economy so early, prime mover, right? And they really capitalized on it. Maybe at some point in the future, there will be just one of so many other high-tech electric mobility companies. So valuation risk, because of all this, your stock prices could be impacted. Your company's value could be significantly impacted. And I think today a renewable energy company and a coal assets company could be looked at very differently in terms of valuation. So, these are all risks, right? Now, opportunities, all the risk on the other side is an opportunity, actually, right? The transition, the low carbon transition is presenting an opportunity of the century, actually. Look at the renewable energy transition, EV transition. Look at how many new companies are coming into, like limelight. Companies that never existed, ether energy from. I mean, you look at the EV and RE sector. There's so many mega corporates today in India. That wasn't there, 10, 15 years ago. So they are going to continue to grow. They are going to be, 100 billion, 200 billion valuations in another 20 years or more, or even, less. So, I mean, a lot of this transition is happening in this clean green tech new markets. So some of these companies are not, fintech, for example. Indian fintech is going all over the world. I mean, new markets. I mean, our ID infrastructure and our digital payment infrastructure, all that's just world winner, right? New partnerships, access to, finance. That's a new big thing. If you have cheaper investment or finance available through green bonds, social bonds, sustainable finance, a lot of avenues opening up. And at the at the very basic, through efficiencies and better optimal processes, there's a whole lot of cost saving also. The first thing companies target is actually efficiency, which improves efficiency and therefore cost significantly. So that's an opportunity that I haven't really listed here. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide. Risk and when talking about risks and opportunities, especially in the climate, I need to talk about TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. This is an interesting. So there's a lot of ESG reporting happening. That's across ES and G, a lot of different numbers, different parameters. But TCFD focuses only on climate, and it has its roots in the Financial Stability Board, which because of the following the 2008 financial meltdown, they wanted to set up this task force to really bring out the impact of climate change, understand that, and make companies put that out for stakeholders for decision making. And TCFD came up with a guideline, not a mandate, it's a guideline, set of principles which companies can use and systematically estimate their climate risk and opportunities, and use that for building business strategies, right? And now a lot of jurisdictions across the world has been adopting this into their disclosure regulations. The UK, many Europe, many New Zealand, Brazil, many countries. This is a built-in component in the BRSR reporting format in India. So there have been a lot of detailed questions on climate risk and opportunities. It is borrowed from this guideline. It is built into that. The RBI has had released a discussion paper which focused specifically on this for the financial sector. So RBI could be looking at this, implementing this across the financial sector at some time in the future. So this is an important tool, and there is, a lot of Indian companies are already reporting, in detail. There is also something called the CDP. It used to be called Carbon Disclosure Project. That's another global reporting platform where companies report on their climate action and their performance. CDP also has adopted TCFD and built it into their annual reporting format. So this is an important thing when you talk about climate risk and opportunities. Actually, the significance part of this is it's not a traditional risk assessment. Traditionally, you look at risk, health and safety risks. Many of you have probably been part of, or you are aware of that process. You look at some kind of frequency and intensity, some kind of grading. Oh, very critical, super critical, important, whatever. But this, you need to translate. If you identify a risk, you need to translate that into revenue risk, dollar terms. Tell me what is the rupee impact or dollar impact, right? And that actually makes it really special. And if you're able to translate into that, then it will tell you, oh wow, this is a significant risk for you. That's like eating into, that's like 6% of your revenue, for example. I'm just saying, and that's something that you have to deal with. So the moment you translate this into dollar rupee terms, it becomes an eye-catching number, both opportunity as well as risk. That is the key part of this TCFD process. So I think this is the last one. Again, TCFD process, please look at that. You can look at some of the Indian reports. I can suggest the Infosys ESG report if you want to see how they have done TCFD risk assessment, how have they reported values. There are many other companies because Infosys is something that I know personally. So with this, I'm going to close this. A lot of things we covered, and I know you have a lot of questions and probably information overload. What you need to do to retain some of this is to really go back and look up and um, recheck and verify and confirm these things by yourself. So these uh, concepts and information, they stay with you, and so please do that. Take some time because I covered a vast area within this topic, and it's not going to be easy to retain all of this unless you do that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for an amazing session, and I'm sure that is received on the card. The questions are welcome and will be explained through email also. And I just want to share that sir will be joining us next week also. So in case you have some questions, you can go back and get clarity from your own research, and then we can have a discussion in the next session maybe. So thank you so much, sir, for your time. I understand that if we have taken up more time than it was in your schedule, so appreciate that, and looking forward to the next session.